Hi, I'm Jared Thomas, and today I'm going to discuss the denomination, the Quakers. The Quakers are a group that I've always found very interesting in American history. One of the things I love about them is the story of kind of how they got their colony. Our textbook by Mark Nold really discusses this and talks about how William Penn was owed, his family was owed a debt by the crown, and the king kind of solved a few of his problems that he had at the time by giving Penn his charter. Not only did he get rid of a troublesome group of dissenters that were the Quakers, he settled the debt that he owed the Penn family, and he also established more settlers and a greater hold on his American colonies as the Quakers and others began to flock to Pennsylvania. Um, One of the things that kind of makes the Quakers stand out in American history was the openness that they had and the acceptance of other groups. This acceptance is discussed by Charles Cohen, helped to make Pennsylvania and what is today Delaware much more successful. And they had an easier time growing and becoming successful because the Quakers didn't exclude other people and were so accepting and allowed more people to join their colonies. That acceptance of other groups revolved around the idea of religious liberty. A lot of groups at the time really wanted people to be practicing religion one way or the other. The Quakers weren't so particular on that. They were more concerned with the idea that you were a follower of Christ, and they didn't care how you practiced that, just as long as your religion was an orderly one. That acceptance allowed more people and encouraged more people to come into Pennsylvania and Delaware and made those colonies much more successful because of that acceptance. Another ideal that I really admire about the Quakers, and something that I always like to point out to my history students in class, is the idea that the Quakers practiced justice and fairness in dealing with who they call the Aborigines, who we would call the Native Americans. A lot of times, the European settlers were just interested in taking the land, claiming the land, and profiting off the land, and they didn't put a lot of stock into how that impacted the Native Americans. But the Quakers really wanted to make sure that they were living in harmony with the Indians. They wanted to make sure that when they took land, that they were paying a fair price for it, not like the story that we hear how Manhattan was purchased with some trinkets. The Quakers wanted to make sure that they were dealing with the Indians in a fair way. I oftentimes pose the question to my kids, how would America look today and how different would American history be if more Europeans would have had those same principles and practiced them in the way that the Quakers did? Uh, Another interesting note on the Quakers that also highlights how they were really forward thinkers for their time, other than the way of how they dealt with Native Americans, but also the way that they stood against slavery. They were some of the original abolitionists, and as James and Lois Horton discussed in an article on the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 and its impact on African Americans, they discuss how the Quakers were one of the first groups of white people to take a formal stand against slavery. And in a time when the world was embracing this institution, the Quakers looked at it and their faith and the Bible and said, this isn't what it says. This isn't what we should be doing. And I think it's really cool because one of our biblical worldviews talks about how we need to view peoples and nations in an ethical way based on our biblical principles. And that kind of resonated with me when I looked at how the Quakers were standing against slavery. But of course, if I'm going to treat the Quakers in an ethical way based on biblical principles, it also is fair to say that even though the Quakers were forward thinking with their ideas against slavery, unfortunately, they were still victims of the time and how they viewed Africans as a whole. And there was oftentimes a lot of controversy among the Society of Friends on whether or not they were going to admit the black people at the time. And unfortunately, a lot of times they didn't admit people based on color. So if we're going to treat the Quakers fairly, it's great to highlight the good things about them, but they also had their failings, and that was kind of a big one. But overall, though, they had a really cool impact on American history, inspired some really great people like William Lloyd Garrison, and helped to lead a charge against an institution that had to go. Thanks a lot.